today's episode of the SSPX Podcast, we'll continue our Apologetics Series by looking at more difficult topics, more controversies that have surrounded the Catholic Church. Today, we'll look at some of the worst instances of human corruption the Church has ever had, from illegitimate indulgences to clerics throughout history helping their family members instead of helping the Church, and all sorts of other bad actors. We'll try to understand how to balance the divine nature of the Church with her very human members. You can find notes to all of these episodes at sspxpodcast.com/apologetics, as well as all our previous episodes. There as well, you can find a link to help support this project. This is free to listen to, as well as all the resources we're posting. But if you can help with a one-time or a small monthly recurring donation, you'll be making sure that we can continue this work of producing good Catholic content on a regular basis. Now, let's join Dr. John Rao for episode number 25 of the Apologetics Series here on the SSPX Podcast. Dr. Rao, thanks for joining us again on our, our fifth time meeting about some issues in the Catholic Church that always come up when we are talking apologetically. Today, we're talking about corruption in the Church. Now, last episode, we talked about bad popes. Today's topic is about corruption. We're going to get into indulgences. That's kind of an obvious one. But why did you want to do a specific separate one about corruption when we've already talked about bad popes? It sort of seems like the same thing, or are they related? Or
yes, they are related, and I wanted to take a little heat off of the clergy as well in discussing this thing. Although, again, they deserve a good deal of criticism for corruption in the Church. But I wrote an article some time ago for the Angelus about corruption in the Church, and it was entitled "It Takes a Christendom." And what I meant to say with this article was that it takes an entire Christian culture to be able to support all of the different elements that are part of it in order to jointly, harmoniously raise themselves up to God. And it also takes the help of a Christendom to prevent corruption. And if what you've got is an entire society steeped in corruption, it's not going to be the case that it's going to be particularly easy for the clerical hierarchy from the papacy on down to be able to fight it, because everything that is powerful around you in secular society, which generally speaking is much more powerful than the spiritual elements in that society, everything around you is going to drag you down and make the efforts of the best possible people within the actual authoritative structure of the Church. It's going to make all their best efforts rather difficult to come to fruition. And the problem that you have periodically, and again, you have it right now, that problem in an extremely intense way. Some of the viewers might remember that in the past couple of lectures, I noted I was preparing the last lectures of my series on church history dealing with the end of the reign of Pope Benedict XVI. And Benedict, in his last talks, describes the fact that you've got an entire secular society around you which is committed to destroying Christianity. And as a result of that, the efforts of the people trying to fight for it are harder than ever. And the latter period of the Middle Ages is a time in many respects like that, where what you've got is a kind of burial in a very secularly focused rut, something which really disturbs all of the reformers of the time, and especially disturbs them because of the fact that there is this way in which everybody in the society around you, among all of the laity, as well as then the clergy which comes out of the laity, everything is just thinking about every specific matter in relation to its secular characteristics. And just a couple of points in this regard that I think need to be emphasized before we would move on to something like indulgences. One, I think I briefly mentioned once before that when people think about a vocation in the 1300s, 1400s, early 1500s. They don't think about a vocation the way we think about a vocation, or at least the Reformed Tridentine Church thought about a vocation, as something which is a calling from God that involves spiritual commitment and sacrifices in that respect. When they talked about vocation, they talked about it in conjunction with how many livings were available, how many possibilities of gaining property or what comes from property to support someone were available. And the greatest effort that was made on the part of the reformers who then went out at Trent was to switch this kind of mentality. Similarly, it is definitely the case that the Roman Curia, which especially after the end of the Great Western Schism and all of the problems that were connected with that in 14, 15, 16, 17, when it came to an end, the Roman Curia and the Roman papacy is in very, very difficult straits financially. And the main focus, to a large degree, there are exceptions, both in terms of pontiffs or sometimes the actions of pontiffs who are basically secularly focused, but generally speaking, it's with this idea of finding ways to pay for everything on a secure basis, which means that you're really in a kind of rut. And just one other follow-up matter in this respect, which is important to the whole indulgences story, is that there are and there have been, with ever-increasing numbers since the 1200s, these various curial officials who are supported in Rome by money that comes from dioceses that they may have the title to as ordinaries, but who never see those dioceses, and in fact will send in effect hirelings to go out in order to take care of them. And parallel to this, there are all sorts of people, chiefly from important noble families, but also from important city councils and city governments and the like. There are important forces elsewhere in Europe that need money or on the hunt for money. And as a consequence, what they'll do is they'll find a way to get a diocese under their control, and take the monies that come from that diocese, and then just simply appoint hirelings to run it. So this is why you have a good number of cases where you don't have just, let's say, someone who is looking for money, who might come from a noble family and have secular family concerns to take care of, who in the hunt for money gets many dioceses under his control, a number of dioceses under his control. But you often find people who are named as the bishop of a given diocese who are not even ordained. They're not even ordained, much less consecrated as bishops. So they've got the title of bishop, they get the money that comes from the diocese, but they can't function as a bishop because they're not even a priest. And therefore, the hirelings that they send in there are sort of twice removed from anything spiritual because the leadership is not even focused on it. So it's no wonder that what happens is that you have a lack of control over what it is that's spiritually going on all over Europe. And then with a kind of lack of interest in correcting things on the part of the Roman Curia, if you can make money off of, let's say, maintaining a lot of what are really abusive situations. Somebody might pay the Roman Curia in order to get a number of dioceses under his control, even though with already existing canonical legislation, you're not supposed to do that. Or you can pay for an exemption to really not fulfill your responsibilities in other regards, simply because the Roman Curia needs the money and is willing to go along with it. So it's a real recipe for endless difficulties. And then if you have a hireling come in to watch over a diocese or a parish or whatever, the hireling is going to be paid insufficiently as well, so that he doesn't have the money at his disposal to be able to take care of other administrative activities in the diocese. That's the story. And you've got people who are so indifferent to their responsibilities. I don't have the information at my fingertips exactly, but I do know, for example, there are major dioceses in places, especially like the German-speaking lands of the Holy Roman Empire, where you've got a territory where no one administers confirmation for close to 3/4 of a century. Just not done. Just not done. So it's a mess. It's a real mess. I mean, despite despite all the horrible abuses that exist today, which in many respects morally are worse, at least people expect that the person who is the Archbishop of New York is going to be a consecrated bishop, right, and generally live there.
That was going to be my next question. You know, we've been hearing about this Vatican bank scandal, and there's a trial going on and all that kind of stuff. There's financial corruption that exists today in the church, but even though the church is going through a crisis, we can say with some optimism that the Vatican at least is taking this seriously, or at least it seems to be taking this seriously, depending on, you know, what side of the story you look at. But at least the guys who are involved in this, you know, London finance deal, and we're not going to get into all that, but at least there's a trial. At least they're going to be held accountable, we hope. It seems like back then there was no even oversight. Excuse me. Did the Pope care? Did the Roman Curia care? I mean, it seems to me that you've said the Curia was involved in this sort of stuff, but for this period of few hundred years, this corruption was just happening and no one seemed to care?
Well, I mean, there are people who care, and even popes at times who care, but who are just overwhelmed by the difficulties of the whole situation. But generally speaking, it's the case that those who are operating in the Roman Curia don't really care. They have their standard operating procedures. Many of them who work there are really in irregular situations. I mean, in terms of not getting ordained, or if they get ordained, never saying a mass because of the fact that nothing is really demanded of them. So it's a very, very painful situation, to say the least. So much so that, I mean, let's say, for example, at the time of the real serious efforts to begin to try to work against this underneath Paul III, you have some of the people who are very instrumental in building the reform and then working at the Council of Trent, who get these responses from curial officials that say, if what we do is we act morally, it will be the destruction of the Roman pontiffs. And then the response to this is, how can it be that the vicar of Christ will be destroyed by doing what's morally just and avoiding what's moral? And under those circumstances, when you get ferociously reforming popes that come onto the scene, people like Paul IV, whom I've mentioned before, they just simply announce that from morning till night, all of these practices are going to stop, whatever the consequences might be financially for the church, and you just have to toss caution to the winds. By the way, not to throw too much cold water on your hopes. I mean, the problem with the dealing with the Vatican Bank, or the IOR, as it's officially referred to, that started to come up really seriously under Paul VI, but more under John Paul II. The problems in dealing with that reflect, I think, nowadays a lot of the difficulties I just mentioned about the secular domination, allowing for continuity of the rut, because the oversight to a large degree is coming from precisely this whole global financial structure, which is tied into the whole effort to build up a new world order, which is totally anti-Christian. And in this respect too, I mean, we've got this situation where Pope Francis had that whole crew of I forget what they call themselves specifically, defenders of responsible capitalism or something, and he named them the Guardians. The Guardians, and if those people are the Guardians, well, you got Plato's the question, the critique of Plato: who guards the Guardians?
Right.
So
right. No, I mean, I wasn't trying to be.
No, I know.
Pink glasses, but oh goodness. All right, so I guess to kind of take a step back, and we will get into indulgences, but this seems to be the indulgence thing. The indulgence topic seems to be a symptom of this overall broader kind of era of corruption within the church. Is that a fair assessment?
That's it. Yeah, it's a an important footnote to the whole thing. But I mean, it's really ultimately, again, a fulfillment of all of the worst fears of two figures I mentioned earlier: Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, and then John of Salisbury, because Saint Bernard said that it's one thing having these administrators and lawyers that have to play a role. It's another thing if the entire hierarchy of values is centered around what they consider to be necessary for keeping the machine going, because then you've got everything flipped on its head. And he said it's not the spirit of Christ; it's the spirit of the entire Roman legal administrative machine, or whatever else might run things. And then John of Salisbury is really important because he saw something which I think has been standard for the whole development of modernity already, that what was growing up in terms of what could be a problem for the church and Christian civilization was the ever-increasing power of finance and of money men. One book that I also, this is like a recurring theme with me that I may have mentioned before, but this one very, very important book for my own development, a set of books, 5 volumes, of a book called The Birth of the Lay Spirit in the late Middle Ages. And the author basically underlines the fact that what you've got that overturns Christendom is the appearance of heretical ideas that are there on the scene, that then play a role with the development of the administrative apparatus of the church, which is necessary for an institution of flesh and blood, but once again, only within the proper hierarchy of values. And then the need for everybody who is either defending something or promoting something to have to find finances for it, and for the money men to try to manipulate everything for their own purposes. So with the ever finer development of the administrative machinery of the church, which ironically reaches its peak with the administration in Avignon, but before the schism. But Avignon before the schism in the 1300s down to 1378, the administrative machinery is just so incredibly perfected that it's really ready to run on its own steam. And in effect, if it wants to reinterpret the entire Christian vision, to just simply feed the beast, and then move on from there. So you gotta at some point just simply strike at it and just let the chips fall where they may, which is what does to not the 100% degree, but to an admirable and effectively transforming degree with the Catholic Reformation.
It seems that another big pushback against the Catholic Church, and this isn't really what we're addressing here today, but is the idea that the Pope should be the spiritual leader. The Catholic Church should be focused on efforts of spirituality, not temporal power, not managing lands, managing money, all that kind of stuff. It seems that the root of all of this corruption that we're talking about today is an inordinate love of riches or power. So, someone might say, just forget about the riches, forget about the power. Let's take that temptation away and let the Catholic Church just work on spirituality. The Pope shouldn't be a temporal leader of the papal states or the Vatican as a nation. What would you say to combat that argument?
Well, I mean, it's just utterly impossible because, again, we're creatures of flesh and blood, and the mystical body is an institution which has got its fleshly side to it as well. And it's just inevitable that this is going to be a constant struggle throughout all of an individual's existence, and then throughout all of a church's existence, an entire society's existence. There's just no way around it. It's not the case, as Lord Acton says. Well, it is the case that absolute power can corrupt absolutely. But it is not the case that power tends to corrupt. Power can tend to do anything. It can tend to ennoble and it can tend to corrupt. Human existence can tend to corrupt and it can tend to ennoble and sanctify a human individual. It's just the nature of a constant struggle. So that if what you tried to do is to say, well, the church can only exist as a spiritual institution, what you're doing is you're just talking about an institution that have no meaning for creatures of flesh and blood. And what, in fact, that kind of mentality has done, and it's already obvious that it's going to do that sort of thing, is clearly there in probably the most dangerous book that was written in the Middle Ages, which is the book which is called The Defender of the Peace by Marsilius of Padua, which was written in the 1340s, because that book is the recipe based upon precisely the argument that you're giving voice there to in the eyes of critics, that it should be a purely spiritual thing. And what it does is it just hands over everything temporal to the defender of the peace, which in his mind was the Holy Roman Emperor, but which could be any other political or secular force, because the argument there is that all things spiritual are corrupted by touching things temporal. So it's left completely in the realm of the quintessences, or the ether, or the purely non-physical realm, and then you just become a slave to the will of whoever it is that claims he's interpreting God's desires. It's impossible. It's just, there's no way a father and a mother of a family can decide that they're going to avoid corrupting the spiritual power of parents by avoiding any kind of temporal activity with their family, their children. I mean, and will they make mistakes? Yes. Will they make bad mistakes? Will some of them really do horrible things? Well, yeah. I mean, yes. Unfortunately, that's the case. But that's life in the fallen world.
Yeah. There are definitely guardrails. There's definitely ways to help prevent this kind of stuff. But as you're saying, there's no way to absolutely separate, church and state. There's no way to absolutely separate the spiritual from the temporal, because the church has to have resources in order to survive, in order to do the works.
Yes. And again, to quote Benedict XVI again, at the speech of his in Freiburg in 2011 on the topic, I think it was that speech, on the topic, what needs to be changed in the church? And his answer to that was you and me. You and me.
Yeah. So let's get into the main point of this episode, which is the selling of indulgences.
Right.
Let me just ask you briefly, one sentence answer: selling of indulgences, bad or good? And then we'll get into the history of it.
Well, I mean, the Council of Trent, in dealing with the whole problem, prohibited it. So it's, and then this was then backed up. I think Pope Pius St. Pius V back this up. So that whole question doesn't exist any longer. Or if it does exist, it's because there are people who have created a new abuse in that regard.
Sure.
Yeah.
So before we get into that, the scandal of the selling of indulgences and the problem with it, let's take just a quick side note, if we could, or a kind of a backstory on indulgences themselves.
Right.
You're not a priest. I'm not a priest. We're not theologians. But broadly, an indulgence is the church giving a, forgiveness of temporal punishment due to sins from its treasury of graces. And that's a good thing. How do we get into money and works and, the temporal side of things? How do those start to get involved with the church granting forgiveness of temporal punishment? Where does that start?
Well, yeah. Let's just go back to the start again. I mean, I don't think anybody has a problem presuming that a pious mother praying for her child who is a louse might be able, under those circumstances, to have her greater merits have an impact on the boy if he repents.
Sure.
I mean, everybody, I think, can understand that. Everybody prays with hopes of that kind of thing. And then we talked about the fact that even though there's instances theologians can point to going right through Scripture, through the earlier period in church history, it's more surrounding the crusading period that the whole movement with indulgences begin. But I did want to note that to begin with, it was spoken of with reference to remitting the temporal punishments imposed by the church canonically. So let's say, for example, if a sinner had been told that he had to, because this was often the case, that he had to go on a pilgrimage in order to atone for some crime that he had committed against the church canonically. What they did then was to say, well, if you go to confession and are absolved from your sins and say these prayers, we'll consider it to be the time that you would have gone on a pilgrimage. And then as they developed where they had the response, where they had the power to do this and the like, they then theologically tapped into, by the 1300s, this whole argument about supererogatory merits and the like, the treasury of merits, and being able to tap into what it is that Christ had earned or the saints had earned, which was over and above what an individual might have at his disposal. And that, too, I think, is a more theologically profound tap into what I just mentioned before. You'd look to the mother and the better merits of the mother for the help of the wayward son. And that was discussed in the 1300s by one of the Avignon popes, Clement VI. Then what ends up happening is that by that time, you've also had developed, it's before Clement VI and the Treasury of Merits, you've had developed the idea that it's not just temporal punishments of the church for canonical issues, but for the actual remissions of sins that are committed other ways, and that they're not just indulgences that can be gained for you, but that you can gain them for people in purgatory as well. You can pray for people in purgatory as well. Actually, the purgatory application comes with Sixtus IV. That's in the 1400s. It really takes until the latter part of the 1400s before you have a pope saying that what's done here can be done not just for you, but for those in purgatory. And by that time, even earlier, I think at the time of the Avignon popes, the argument is that the granting of these indulgences is in the hands of the pope. The pope is the one who has the key to the treasury of merits. There were already questions about this that people were asking. Theologians were asking, but we might as well, push them off to discussing at the time of Luther. Now, what ends up happening is that, the 1300s are not a happy period of time, and much of the 1400s is not a happy period of time. It gets better for people on an economic level, even on a physical level with regard to diseases when you get into the latter part of the 1400s. But you've got all these troubles with the bubonic plague, with war, the 100 Years' War, with the collapse of authority in Italy and Germany, with the Turks invading, with all sorts of troubles. And there is a gloominess about spirituality and about the horror of sudden death and the like that is very much developed by preachers in the 13 and 1400s. And what it does is it very much increases, we can see this in any number of regards, the population's terror of sudden death without having done enough for the remission of sins, with spending endless time in purgatory. And as a result of that, the whole emphasis on gaining indulgences in order to be able to deal with the problems of sudden death. I mean, if the plague comes into town within 2 weeks, you could have a third of the population gone.
Yeah,
it grows. And you can see that there's a general desire to tap in to these indulgences and get indulgences. And in fact, just to leap ahead for a minute to Albert of Brandenburg, who's the one that's at the center as a bishop of the whole issue with Luther, he himself said that he had collected 39 million years of temporal remission of punishment. And whether he understood what that meant is another question as well, because it's a difficult concept. It's not really that difficult if you actually approach it, but people just don't necessarily approach it to really grasp what's at hand there. Just like it was never that difficult to read a missal to learn what the priest was saying in Latin before the changeover, but
right.
A lot of people just didn't want to bother to do it. All right, so as they develop all of these ideas, and the demand for indulgences grows more and more and more, with the fear of sudden death and the preaching about the need for doing penance for one's sins to avoid dying suddenly. Well, as all this grows, the idea of gaining an indulgence by charitable donations enters into the picture as well. Charitable donations as being a means of gaining God's favor. And even though the granting of indulgences was theoretically, canonically, more and more placed in the hands of the Pope, that didn't stop people on local levels from trying to tap into it if it was financially effective for, let's say, well, to take just one clear example, in southern France, a lot of parishes in southern France, by the time you get into the 1300s and 1400s, have a kind of I think in some places a little pool like the Trevi Fountain, although I don't know if you heard the news today about the Trevi Fountain with the climate activists.
No.
They trashed the Trevi Fountain. They dumped
that's good.
oil and charcoal and turned it black. They said it's going to take a lot of time to be able to fix it again. But they have either pools or buckets or whatever, and it's for people to toss coins into for the souls in purgatory. And the idea is that as you toss the coin in, the souls in purgatory will benefit from your charitable donation, which is going to go to the work of the parish. So you've got a kind of tapping into the idea of gaining something for the souls in purgatory in a way that's aiding the local parish. All right. Now that's outside of any kind of canonical rules for tapping into the treasury of merit or whatever it might be. But what happens is that at Rome, in the restored papacy, after the end of the Great Western Schism, you get the Roman Curia and the Roman pontiffs deciding that this is something that you can work with as well. And it emerges actually, understandably, out of the pontiff's efforts before Avignon, and actually through the entire crusading period, to gain money for the crusade, for crusading purposes as charitable activities. I'm not personally aware of how much before the 1400s this was tied in with indulgences, but certainly by the time you get into the 1400s, and of course you've got new crusades being called to deal with the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, the Turkish takeover of Constantinople, the advance into Europe in the late 1400s. You got lots of calls for crusading money. And there was one cardinal, in particular, Cardinal Raymond Perrault, a French Augustinian, who lived between 1435 and 1505, who developed a kind of career with the papacy of calling for men, but then financial aid for the Crusades in a way that would give people indulgences in exchange for money donations. And he travels around a good deal. He's a sort of expert organizer in this regard. But you can see that there's a lot of distrust at that time, not about indulgences, not about the right of the papacy to grant the indulgences, but about whether the money that they're collecting is really going to go to the Crusades or into somebody's pocket. There's even there's a popular expression. I mean, I haven't heard it used recently, but I mean, when you learn Germanic idioms, one Germanic idiom, a verb is Türken, to Turk, and what it means is to try to connive and manipulate somebody to get something for a purpose which is really not the one that's proclaimed. But we have examples of, let's say, for example, Perrault going into areas and trying to get money for crusading purposes, and then having an indulgence attached to it as a charitable donation. That's a good thing. With local authorities saying, well, maybe we'll allow you to go along with this if you give us part of the cut. If you give us part of the cut. And this seems to have happened in a variety of ways, but the way it's going to really come to the fore is going to be with the grand cause célèbre of all connected with indulgences, and that's the one that involves Luther.
I guess so just looking at it from an optimistic point of view, or from a very basic point of view, you look at, for instance, the building of the new Immaculata in St. Mary's. Right. People who are working on that. Let's say the Pope got involved and said, "Hey, anyone who's working on the Immaculata, this is a good work for the glory of God. If you're working on it, and if you're giving your time and your energy, and you're literally working on this building, you can get an indulgence." Great, perfect. Then you have maybe some people who are disabled, or some older people who say, "I can't do that. I want the indulgence. Here, I'm going to give some money so someone else can do it." That makes sense. Oh, yeah. You can get an indulgence for donating the money. The problem is people start going too far, and human corruption gets involved. And so that's basically kind of the through line of what you're saying is how is it that we get from people doing good works to work off their punishment, right, translating into money? It's that kind of logic, which makes sense, but it's problematic real quick.
Yeah, it's like, again, it's the problem of saving the appearances properly. But I mean, again, nobody would deny under any circumstances that donating I mean, if I'm a rich man and I build a hospital, a Catholic hospital, I mean, I'm doing something which is a charitable work that God, God in His mercy may very well reward me for. But it's the problem of then saying specifically, well, you're being rewarded to the effect of remitting all of the time that you would have spent for the temporal for the temporal acts that you had to do of penances for the sins you've committed up till you've confessed them. That it's awkward there, and it's always going to be misunderstood by people. And in fact, anybody. This is literally anybody. Any parent, any teacher, any pastor making announcements at church knows that what you say is interpreted by people in a million different ways, and very oftentimes to their advantage.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. You started to lead into this point, which is the main issue of indulgences with Martin Luther. And this all, correct me if I'm wrong, but from my reading of history, excuse me, the main problems that Luther had was this glut of indulgence giving and granting that was happening around the construction of St. Peter's. Julius II, who we've talked about before, he passes away. We get Leo X, not a great pope. He realizes he needs a lot of money for St. Peter's, and so he starts basically handing out indulgences like candy to get funds for St. Peter's. Do I have that history right?
Well, no, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And the real center of the problem is in the Roman Curia, under Leo X at the time, but also in the specific problem of Albert of Brandenburg. All right, it's the conjunction, because the indulgence for the donation to the rebuilding of St. Peter's went into effect in 1506. What happens now is a kind of tapping into that whole project there, which was not, as far as I know, causing any kind of great stir anywhere in terms of a criticism. The tapping into that project specifically by Albert of Brandenburg, that's where the trouble comes in, and which then evokes the greed of the Roman Curia, but in conjunction, particularly with this fellow. So we have to talk about Albert of Brandenburg before anybody else. Now Albert of Brandenburg is he's born in, when is he born? 1490. All right, 1490. So he's from the Hohenzollern family, which is a hugely important family. The family came to importance because of its connection with one of the crusading orders, the Teutonic Knights. And he, as part of this family, is somebody who has to be provided for. All right, so he's born in 1490. By the time he is 20, he's starting to accumulate dioceses under his control. All right. In his case, I was trying to check up on this today, and I forgot to actually look at. There's a source which is called Catholic Hierarchy that has got pretty much everybody from the beginning that you can find information on listed, and I looked him up in order to be able to remind myself of how many dioceses he had under his control, and I forgot to check the statistic to see whether or not he was actually ordained himself, but I think he was. So if you look up, if you've got it there, you look up Albert of Brandenburg, you might be able to find an ordination date for him. But I mean, even if he were, by Trent's standards, he would have had, and he's not the worst example of this, he would have had bishoprics under his control before the date that he would have been considered eligible to be ordained. But then again, he was ordained in 1513, but he has looks like he has a lot of dioceses under his control. Yep. So he's already got this before he would legitimately now be able to be ordained. Although it's not as bad as people who were already named cardinals before they were even born, But
right.
That. So I think he's an accumulator of dioceses. And he's the administrator of the Diocese of Halberstadt, which is already an important thing. But he's also got this hugely important Diocese of Magdeburg under his control. And he wants and then gets also the Archdiocese of Mainz. And Mainz has tied with it very important responsibilities. You're one of the small numbers of electors of the emperor, the handful of people who elect the emperor if you're the Archbishop of Mainz. And you're also, I believe, the chancellor of the Holy Roman Emperor if you're the Archbishop of Mainz. And he, in order to get this diocese under his control, he's got to pay a lot of money. He's got to pay a lot of money. He's got to pay a lot of money because the Roman Curia demands a good sum of money for you to really be invested with the pallium, this ceremonial skin for being in control of a diocese. And Rome has got its demands of what needs to be paid it, which are quite high. But then he's also got to pay some money to be exempted from the canonical rules, which ought not to allow him to have this extra diocese under his control. So in order to pay Rome, he's got to borrow money. Because he doesn't have it. And this is, by the way, one of the chief already existing circumstances of the rulers generally in Europe, or noble families in Europe, that they got to go into hock to money men. They've got to go into hock to money men or make deals with money men. And so what he does is he borrows a lot of money from the big banking company of the day in Augsburg, the Fugger. We call the Fugger Corporation or whatever. It's like the BlackRock of the, of the. So what happens is he's got to pay all of this money. Now he wants to find a way to recoup so that he can pay the Fugger. So what he does is he makes a deal with the Roman Curia that they will grant an indulgence. They will grant an indulgence to be preached in his two big provinces of Magdeburg and Mainz. And the indulgence will be to give money. The purpose will be to give money for the rebuilding of St. Peter's, which is still being rebuilt. However, he is going to be able to get half the profits.
Goodness.
He's going to split it 50%. So 50% is going to go to Albert in order to repay the Fugger family for the loan that he's taken, which he took out to pay Rome for exemptions. I mean, this is not pleasant.
Right.
This is not pleasant. So that's the background. So Rome grants indulgence, and they name Albert the commissioner, in charge of the indulgence. But I mean, Albert doesn't have any knowledge of how to preach an indulgence, and I'm not even certain that he understood what it was all about. I mean, I'm not sure if he understood whether or not it involved time for penances that you're doing here on earth, as opposed to 39 million years in purgatory in a place where you count time at all anyway. I don't know what he thought, but his sub-commissioner is Johann Tetzel. All right, it's Tetzel. Right now, Tetzel is a Dominican, and Tetzel is a German. All right, Tetzel is a German, I believe, from Nuremberg. Tetzel has an interesting career. He had traveled to Spain. When was Tetzel born? I think in 1465 he's born, and he traveled to Spain before the final conquest, of Granada, and he came back. He was really horrified by the influence of Muslim customs in Spain, and also again the Moranos in Spain. He was a little bit disturbed by all of this stuff, but he comes back, and he is the man who is in charge of the preaching of the indulgence and having to get other people to help him with the preaching of the indulgence. So what ends up happening is that this is going to go into operation, and Albert sends out a summary instruction, an instruction for what this is all about. And the summary instruction is already a confusing thing. It's already a confusing thing because of the fact that, as you can see already with the willingness of the Roman Curia to accept exemptions from canonical regulations in exchange for a money payment, there's all kinds of other little tricky things here involving exemptions that can be seen in the summary instruction. I mean, for example, you got to go to confession. You got to go to confession before the indulgence will have any impact. You've got to go to confession and then be absolved of your sins. But there are certain sins that are reserved to bishops and others reserved to the Pope himself. And in the summary instruction, there's indications, well, under these circumstances, some of these are obviated, and it doesn't have to be that you go to this one as opposed to that one. Normally, you would go to your parish priest. In fact, in canon law, I'm not certain. I'm not a canon lawyer. I don't know whether this exists or not still. But the general idea, from Fourth Lateran Council onward, was when you fulfilled your Easter obligation, it was at your local parish priest. But everybody from the very beginning fled to Franciscans and Dominicans, so they didn't have to go to the local parish priest who might know who they were when they were confessing things.
Yeah.
So it seems to have been the case, and this enters into Luther's argument as well, that people who were listening, people who were given the instruction in order to preach the indulgence, much less people who were going to hear those preaching the indulgence, were a little bit confused as to who you had to go to, when you had to go to him, how it would be done, in a way that through their preaching could then allow people to think, well, maybe the confession is just a formality after all. And maybe you could get the indulgence and then put off the confession until a time when it was suitable for you to go to the confession, in a way that, could easily fit in with the easy conscience of some people, not to speak of the people who were hearing this and didn't understand a word of what you were talking about,
Sure.
just wanted to get a plenary indulgence that would free them of all of their temporal penances. So that's what Luther is going to get upset about, and he's going to write a letter to Albert of Brandenburg, which is going to involve the statements that come down to us as the 95 Theses that he is going to put on the in effect notice board by the palace of the local ruler, the Elector, Frederick, the Elector of Saxony. Now, by the way, Frederick, the Elector of Saxony, is a man who also believes in indulgences. And he's also one of the greatest collectors of relics in Europe. And there have already been indulgences attached to saying prayers before the relics, many of which he's got in his palace in Wittenberg. And he smells, Frederick, this money-making scheme of Albert, and he prohibits his subjects from electoral Saxony to cross over into the territories where he prohibits his subjects from having the indulgence preached to them in electoral Saxony. And he tells them, if you want to gain indulgences, what you should do is come and visit my palace, where you can gain an indulgence because of prayers at the relics that I have present here. And of course, if pilgrims stream in to Wittenberg, I mean, there's going to be profits to be made off of these pilgrims as well. So he doesn't want them to come into his territory. So Luther now, as a subject of his, is going to write to complain about the whole thing. Some of his subjects, Frederick's subjects, leave his territory to go into the territories where the indulgence is being preached, and that irritates him still more that they're doing that. So you can see how a budding alliance could grow up here if it all really blew up. But in any case, Luther then posts his arguments publicly, which, as you know, was not this dramatic gesture as is
right.
depicted in painting. I mean, it's just an announcement of a call to debate and discussion, which was a common thing you would do. And there is going to be obviously a discussion, but I mean, Luther is himself. He wears a number of hats. I mean, he's a monk, but he's a very, very effective preacher. And when he wants to write in a style which is a rabble-rousing preaching style, which he does write a good deal in, he's learned through his training as a humanist. He's learned how to manipulate words. He knows how to use words very, very effectively. So he's going to have a very, very, very effective mode of expressing himself, and he's tapping into a problem with regard to this question of indulgences, which is misunderstood by people, and even if it's on the up and up, because of the appearances connected with the money issue, can readily be misunderstood. And in this case, there is something fishy about the whole thing. Why should Albert get half of the money for indulgence?
Sure.
It's a charitable act that you're contributing to pay back money for something which is an exception to an abuse, and the like. It's very, very awkward. So that there's a lot of things Luther says which just bring up serious questions, questions which can be answered, some of them, but need to be addressed in a way that would not allow for popular abuses to emerge. But there's also in these statements of his the reference to what will be developed as his core doctrinal, dogmatic axe to grind with the entire system, not just of the Roman Church, but ultimately of the Orthodox Church in the East as well. So he becomes the voice for a lot of the complaints here, or confusions here.
Can I jump in for a quick second? Sorry.
Sure.
In terms of Luther's criticism of indulgences, and I know he's going to go into a lot of other areas, and we all know the Protestant heresy is going to go off the rails, but just looking at his criticism of indulgences, was he correct to bring that up? And was he correct in saying there's a problem here? Pope's got to figure this out.
He's correct, but the correct part veers into the incorrect part.
Right.
It's not.
Okay.
They're not separate alone, and it's not the case. It is absolutely the case, and this is hugely important for the whole future development of Protestantism. It is absolutely the case that Luther does not see the logical consequences of his central theme, and he is a nominalist by philosophy. He believes of the fact that philosophical discussions of the will of God are really not capable of being made. And ultimately what's going to happen is that when he talks about the obvious will of God, it's going to be that obvious will of God connected with Luther's central doctrinal deviance from the Roman Church. But he's not going to see all the logical consequences of his own ideas. And as a result of that, he's just going to try to smash all of the more logical, more radical Protestants by means of political power coming to his aid on behalf of his more conservative vision of Protestantism.
Okay.
But it is the case that he has already developed his central idea to a large degree before he applies it to the indulgence question. And we know this because we know that he was bandying about with a number of his colleagues his speculations on the question of sin and forgiveness of sin for a year or so before the indulgence issue came up. And in fact, when he first heard Luther's idea, one of the most important early leaders of the radicalizing faction, the man who is referred to by people popularly as Karlstadt, who was a colleague of his at the new University of Wittenberg, he was shocked when he heard what Luther had to say, but then takes the ball and runs with it later. So Luther's 95 Theses, which are there in the letter that he writes to Albert of Brandenburg, ostensibly to complain about the instruction, the summary instruction for the preaching of the indulgence, it's got sound questions that some of which may in fact have already been addressed theologically, but which are popularly still misunderstood. It's got a real sense of horror about corruption in the church, which is laudable in many respects. And in fact, a number of the people in the debating theological world who are going to read Luther's comments here, because Luther sends them around to the chief figures of the day in the different universities in Germany, a number of those who are going to become very swiftly his very serious enemies. At first glance, they're glad that he did this. They're glad that he did this, but they're going to turn around when they're aware of what it is. There's only, I think only really among the reputable theologians of Germany at the time, the only one who from the very outset smelled the big problem here was Eck, Johannes Eck, who was going to be his opponent at the Leipzig disputation. But Luther wrote respectfully to Eck because he thought he would be totally on his side. So it's a mixture of things that are there.
So how does the church start to unravel this? They obviously the Protestant Reformation starts happening. Does the Pope at some point or another start to realize we've got to figure out this whole indulgence thing and we've got to start putting in some safeguards? Does that happen right away, or does that take a while?
No, that doesn't happen right away at all. I mean, what's going to happen is that the whole question is going to be dealt with in such a ultimately reprehensible manner that it's the reason why decades are given for the whole thing to spread. I mean, there is one very, very serious figure involved in an attempt to try to deal with the question just one-on-one with Luther. And that's with the meeting that Luther has with Cardinal Cajetan, the very great Dominican neo-Thomist scholar who understands what the problem is here. But it's just too steeped in too many political, financial, other difficulties for the Roman authorities to take seriously as they ought to have done. It just gets swallowed up in a number of other matters that, I mean, if we have the time, we could go into. But I don't know if we can. But let me just mention beforehand, though, I mean, Luther does bring up a lot of questions that people did have and confusions that people popularly have. In other words, with respect to things like what time, are people really sufficiently aware of what you're talking about when you're talking about the time connected with these indulgences. Even if he doesn't specify that specifically, it's referring to confusions of that sort. There was a lot of confusion over this question of applying the merits to the souls in purgatory, because the question is, how can they benefit from that if they can't go to confession any longer, whereas the person taking the indulgence can still go to confession. Luther, and I think it's number 82 of the 95 Theses, brings up this question, which is going to be one that it sounds serious. It's a good rhetorical talking point, that if the Pope has the authority over this whole treasury of merits, why doesn't he just empty it out all at once, and give it to everybody, so that they can all then be freed from their sin, from the penances they have to do on earth, and start from scratch again? Why can't they do just that? Why doesn't it just liberate everybody all at once, or for that matter, apply it to all the people in purgatory so that they can all get out? And this is as I say, a kind of rhetorical talking point, because it just is so stripped from outside of the picture of personal responsibility and what you'd be talking about in terms of an individual, on pilgrimage through life, taking advantage of something like this to move on forward, to keep just going through the same actions again and again, requiring a further emptying of the treasury of merits in the future. There's all sorts of stuff, but the bigger problem is that after starting off recognizing the authority of the Pope and seemingly not attacking indulgences as such, in other numbers of the 95 Theses, you can see that Luther is talking about the question of repentance for sin and penance for sin as something which is separate from the whole sacramental act of confession and absolution. I mean, he doesn't dot the I's and cross the T's on it, but he talks about it in such a way as to make it clear that his discussion here is veering outside of the entire sacramental structure of the individual penitent, the individual and his responsibility for his sorrow for his sins and the confrontation with the priest. You got to look at all of them to see how there's these seeds that are there, and not everybody who was reading them saw all of that in the picture, and instead they heard the assault on the abuse that could be obvious to anybody who knew what Albert of Brandenburg's whole game in this thing was. I mean, you can imagine, let's say, for example, if somebody of importance, attacked all, and in fact, you do have examples of this, attacked some of the most blatant defenses of communion for the divorced and civilly remarried, the same-sex marriages. If they attacked all of that stuff and would win the support of a lot of well-meaning Catholics, while at the same time not really correcting a lot of other problems that they had, that could lead you to be led down the primrose path in a different direction. And so, I mean, it was the initial, assault that really won a lot of people over. And then, as it becomes more clear where Luther is going, then they back away from him. But as far as the church is concerned, it takes a while. I mean, the whole rest of the pontificate of Leo X, and then his successor, Pope Clement, and then even going into, again, the reign of Paul III. I mean, Paul III, as we mentioned in talking about the corruption of the papacy, Paul III is the bane of the existence of a number of the legates at the Council of Trent, because The politics of the Farnese family clearly take precedence in his mind still till his very death over what's going on in Trent. And underneath Leo, and then underneath Clement, and into the reign of Paul III, the question of the political power of Charles V, and whether or not that's going to be dangerous for the papacy, takes precedence over fighting the Protestants or dealing with the Protestant issue. And even in that very short reign of Pope Adrian in the 1520s, who had been a kind of tutor and a spiritual father for the young Charles V. I mean, that poor fellow was going to be swept up into all kinds of concerns for political issues as well. It's teeth grinding, seeing everybody going off and fighting the wrong battles. And it's teeth grinding for people like Eck, for example. Poor Eck. I mean, Eck is deeply committed to fighting the good fight. People complain about him because he can be really, rather rough in his arguments. But all you have to do is read Luther to see that this is the tone of these people to a large degree at the time. And he's got a rough time, Eck, and has kind of a liking for the bottle as well. But he fights the good fight, and he's just tortured by the lack of seriousness on the part of most people. And how could your average bishop be serious when your average bishop sometimes is not even a priest, generally politically minded, and then your average bishop, even when he's got a solid education, and many of them do have a solid education, their education is a legal education. Yep. And it's not a theological education. And they don't understand what's at stake here. They don't understand what's going on here. It goes in one ear and out the other. And that's grist for Luther's mill as well, because he can point it out to people. He says these people are just, they're not concerned about the issues that really are important to God. Right.
So to kind of recap where we are from here, we have this whole series, if I can kind of summarize it in 20 seconds, which I'll try to do. We have this whole series of corruption where bishops and archbishops are being appointed where they really have no place of being. So now we have the hierarchy and the curia of the church is all being staffed by these guys who really have, I shouldn't say no spiritual emphasis, but very little spiritual emphasis, painting with a broad brush here. And then when these problems do start to arise, you have a real crisis of Luther and these reformers, quote unquote reformers, trying to say, hey, there's problems within the church. They don't really care about the spiritual side of things. They're not well equipped to handle this fight, this battle, because they're all still kind of infighting and working for their own political power. And so the church takes a little while to kind of get their wheels spinning. What Luther's thesis, in 1517, and the Council of Trent's not called till 1545 and doesn't really end until 10, 15 years later. So we have almost 2 generations going past where nothing's really done about these huge issues. Meanwhile, Protestantism and these errors are really starting to spread because of the printing press, et cetera.
Right. Well, I mean, again, the situation is the worst in the whole of Central Europe. That's where and in France, it's not good either. Spain had been cleaned up to a large degree underneath Isabella, with Isabella's work and the great Cardinal Cisneros in Spain, but and the Spanish episcopacy and also the learned people who aid the Spanish episcopacy are going to be very, very much at the center of promoting the most root and branch reforms at the Council of Trent. They're hugely important. And what's interesting about them as well is that they are also aware of another problem that's connected with the situation, even when you're cleaning up the church its worst sort of money-focused, secular-focused internal issues. And that is the fact that you have to protect yourself against political domination. The Spanish bishops at the Council of Trent were very much concerned about the strength of the Spanish monarchy being so great that it could end up dominating the episcopacy in a way that would not allow it to continue to do its primarily spiritual job. And they had an example to look to, which proves the point, because you had another church in Europe that was cleaned up in a way that caused it to be rid of some of the worst abuses of what was going on in the German world, but cleaned up in a way that linked it totally with the outside political structure, and committed to working with the outside political structure as a means of just simply calming what had been a very, very troubled situation politically inside the country, including civil war for any number of years, and that's England. The episcopacy in England was quite trained, quite educated. Yes, with people like Cardinal Wolsey, very much steeped in a kind of personal corruption, but much more tightly disciplined than anything in Germany. But it needed to have a monarch that would not abandon the faith in order to be able to function properly. And when you got the monarch who did, after initially seeming to be one who was against Luther, what it did is just caved in like a house of cards to it. You needed to have an episcopacy that was soundly formed in what the duties of a bishop was, what the duties of a bishop were, in union with a papacy that was soundly trained with regard to what its primarily spiritual goals were, guided by this spiritually focused reform movement, which thankfully does have more and more of an influence as time goes on. Never 100% influence, otherwise we wouldn't be in the situations we were in afterwards. Again, but a greater influence.
Yeah,
great enough to avoid the problems of bishops who are not even bishops, and the worst apparent abuses of anything connected with indulgences, which are really dealt with by Trent and by St. Pius V.
Wow, this has been fascinating. On your notes you passed along, you said there's a saint who comes around, St. Catherine of Geneva, and she has a big role to play. Who is she and what did she do?
St. Catherine of Geneva is one of my favorite saints. She lived between 1435 and 1505, and she influenced any number of different reform groups, lay groups, mixed lay clerical groups, groups that in Italy, where she was, first and foremost active, took on the name of congregations or societies of divine love. She's the inspiration behind the people who create the Theatines that Pope Paul IV was part of. She's very much an inspiration to the Jesuits as well. And her whole thrust of the argument is that that the rut of corruption that the church is steeped in her day is not something that's going to be cured by means of ultimately even councils and canonical legislation and the like, because all of the canonical legislation is there. All of the rules are there. The problem is the secular-minded, legally steeped individual it doesn't want to see the fact that the minute that you legislate still more, you find more exemptions that end up giving you a way out of this. It's in the nature of the beast, of the legal beast, to just generate more and more and more discussions of how you can avoid responsibilities that you have and get away with things. And I mean, in this regard, I can quote a friend of mine. He's deceased, long deceased friend of mine, who I remember decades ago. He said something which really impressed itself on my mind. He said to me, Anglo-Saxon legal procedures, he said, have proven in their development to have been probably the best means of determining guilt or innocence. He said, but when you put Anglo-Saxon legal procedures in the hands of people who operate, and I'm going to use this term in the way in which people generally understand it, because of all of the ins and outs of it, including the critiques within the particular religious group we're going to mention. You put it in the hands of people with a Talmudic mentality, with endless distinctions, or for that matter, the worst of the abuses of scholastic, logic, as people debate what one thinker said about another thinker, thinking about another thinker, thinking about another thinker, and the way in which you get academic footnotes piling up for thousands of pages. You never end the legal arguments. So St. Catherine of Siena said, and all of the people influenced by her said, the job of the spiritual director is to make everyone, layman, cleric, put face to face with the horror of a sin against God, and recognizing that you are going to have to stand there to answer before God for what you did. And you're not going to be able to pull up your 16 legal documents granting you 800 exemptions, which required you to get money from the House of Fugger in order to deal with this, because you're going to have your naked soul facing the all-loving God. And so she said, you've got to put everybody face to face with the reality of the horror of sin, and then say to them, what is your vocation in life? And is what you're doing really fulfilling your vocation in life? And it's this that really inspired all of these reformers. And even with St. Ignatius is also influenced by the Brethren of the Common Life and the like. The spiritual exercises, they evoke the kind of things that St. Catherine of Geneva did with regard to facing the evils of purgatory. St. Ignatius says, depict hell in all of its horror. Depict it all in all of its horror, and then see that you are going to be responsible for answering God, And that's what the spirit of these... Paul IV was horrified by legal discussions. That's why he didn't want to call another session of the Council of Trent, because he says it's just going to be more debating. What's needed now is the soul before God and answering it, and then striking, against the abuses there. That's the spirit that ended up motivating these people.
It's fascinating. As we go through the history of the church, we see these periods where the church dives into the legal arguments, dives into the practical elements, and it always takes a saint, it takes good theologians to come back and say, yes, we need all this, but at the end of the day, you've got to have the spiritual life, you've got to have the interior life, you've got to have that, otherwise none of this is going to work.
No. And then, I've been doing a lot of lecturing and other things. I can't remember whether I've said this here or elsewhere, but again, when people bring up all of this stuff about the corruption in the church, those who know the history of the church, even they're horrified by the corruption, but it never ever obviates the beauty of it. And forgive me if I mentioned this once before, but Dietrich von Hildebrand was in the 1920s present in Rome at the side of Ludwig von Pastor, who in the 20s became the ambassador to the Holy See of the new Republic of Austria. And he was present with him at a canonization ceremony. I don't know whose canonization it was. And von Hildebrand said that here was Ludwig von Pastor, who had written these 40 volumes in which endless crimes of popes, bishops, priests are all depicted. And he said, he's there at this canonization, and he said he's sobbing in tears because he knows that the beauty of the church is more than this pettiness. In fact, St. Catherine of Geneva, she points out, when you confront yourself with a sin, in front of the eyes of God, and you realize, every sin, including the greatest, most horrendous sin, is just shown to be the piece of little filth that it really is, and then the overwhelm. You could not possibly be in the sight of the overwhelming majesty and holiness of God if you were still steeped in that bit of filth, because you'd realize you'd have to go hide yourself in shame from it. You can't, and you can't hide yourself in shame with it. But I had an exemption.
Right. This is fascinating. You brought up a little bit earlier what Pope Benedict XVI, he had a great desire, I think, and you know more about this than I do by far, but it seems to me he had a great desire to root out corruption, but he was very much on the academic side of things. He was very much a theologian. He wasn't really a mover shaker. He was kind of a quiet academic. But he did speak about corruption quite a bit in regards to the church today, right?
Oh, yes, indeed. And of course, remember in this regard that one of the last episodes that disturbed his pontificate was the Vati Leaks episode, which was all about making known things that were there coming out of his office with regard to all kinds of subjects, including corruption. And much of what those Vati Leaks were all about were rather insignificant. But what they did also reveal was the fact that there was this investigation that had gone on underneath Archbishop Vigano at the time. Archbishop Vigano had been entrusted with the investigation of corruption underneath what's called the Governorate in the Vatican. And one of the things that was revealed by the journalist who worked in cahoots with the valet, who seems to have been a poor, confused, psychologically disturbed fellow. But one of the things was these documents from Vigano that were complaining about his being removed from his position and sent off as nuncio to the United States, because he complained that there were people who did not want him to investigate it. And Benedict makes mention of this in his series of interviews with his biographer Sewald. He makes mention of it, and he says that that it was an important position that they sent Vigano to, but that he was pursuing all of this stuff, and there were people who were complaining that he was going about it in too relentless a way. So he's very much aware of the corruption in the church. He says outrightly, he said, "I did not abdicate because of the fact that I was overwhelmed by the corruption." He said, anybody who knows the history of the church knows it's filled with corruption. And unfortunately, that's the case. So he specifically countered an argument by an American journalist that he had abdicated because he was overwhelmed by the corruption. He said that's not the case at all. But it's there, and it's something that would I think disturb anybody, but he admits that his chief failing as Pope was that he was an academic and that he wasn't much of an administrator. And he said that when he got so tired towards the end, it was as though, I can't remember if this is he or Genswein, his secretary, saying this, that every time there was a new folder about a new problem put on his desk, it was like a declaration of war, against his physical stamina. But it's what it is. But it's it can be overwhelming, and it can be so. How do I phrase this? To me, as a historian, it's never done anything but confirm my faith. It's never done anything but confirm my faith, because you can always see, when you look at past eras of corruption, you can see, because there's going to be an era of renewal afterwards, and you see that when you're in the pit of the corruption, all these forces working for the renewal are all there, already. And it's a crime, and it's a scandal that the stuff is taking place that's taking place. But nevertheless, it's just a cause for joy for me to know that you can't get rid of us. You just can't get rid of us. It's going to come out in God's providence, the way God wants it to come out through all the trials. But it's disillusioning, and it is something that can cause lots of people to abandon if they don't know the reality, or don't want to admit the reality of the human condition.
I was doing an episode with Father Reuter a couple of years back when we were doing the Crisis series. And there was one episode, I don't remember exactly what episode it was, but we were going through, big crises, big problems, corruption in the church, after the Second Vatican Council, all that. And I remember sitting at the end of the episode, just defeated, discouraged, just upset. And he could tell, and he's like, "Don't worry, it's okay. This crisis, this is a mystery. This is something that God has given us. And this is actually a good thing for us to be able to reflect on the mystery of this crisis, and that God's providence will win in the end. This is not a pessimistic thing. This isn't something to be discouraged about. This is something to actually be optimistic about, that God has control of everything, not us." And it's kind of similar to what you're saying. It's God's working all of this through the corruption of us.
Yeah. No, and again, to go... like as we've discussed, I've been involved in this since I was 19 years old. In the traditionalist camp since I was 19 years old. And the 1970s, again, were really dreary. Dreary in this regard. Although I even in the 1970s, I don't remember ever suffering incredible depression. There was a period in the 1980s when I just got fed up with it seeming as though anything I was doing was not causing any kind of dent in the arms of the enemy. And so I kind of took probably about a 2-year hiatus from the whole thing. But then I was dragged back into it, thankfully, by being asked to lecture in Ridgefield. That's how I got back into the whole picture. And then when I look at it from the standpoint of, the handful of ragged people we were at the beginning seeming to deal with this. You look at pictures of us taken at tiny little gatherings in church basements, and we look like pictures of the most forlorn leaders at the end of the Third Republic in France. And then now, the groups I'm encountering, and then the quality of the audiences. I was lecturing a week ago for the society in Chicago, and they were apologizing to me. They were saying, "Oh, we're sorry that there's only the small number of people. Everybody is frightened of Chicago now." But there were 60 people in the audience. I said, 60 people is, a triumph, of the greatest order. And then the questions that were coming from these people were all serious questions. And in comparison to the kinds of questions you would get among the ragtag group of us in the 1970s, my gosh, it demonstrated just how much progress the whole movement has made. When I went off to England after having started with the seeing everything falling into a worse and worse pit in the early 70s, I went off to England to study, and those who had introduced me into the movement, they said, just concentrating on your doctorate, because there'll be enough battles to fight when it's over. And so I did, and there were certain elements in England that were fighting. That's where I met Michael Davies and the people who had there all kinds of ties with the budding movement of Archbishop Lefebvre as well. Then when I came back after my stay there, I went to the first meeting of the Roman Forum that I attended, and I went into the meeting and I met I think it was Dr. Thomas Molnar who was there, and I said to him, "How is the movement going?" And he said, "The movement is stationary." I thought that sounds pretty depressing.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. It wasn't even then. And it's just grown bigger and bigger. And one of the greatest joys to me now is that there is this whole new generation. In my case, at 72 now, it's now 2 generations that have gone through. And my own children are part of it as well, that are there ready to take up, and they are taking up the work that I've done, and so many other people before me did, and contemporaries of mine did. And so there's no reason to be, hopeless. And in fact,
sure,
I may even die a martyr. That would be the best thing of all.
Yeah, it would be. It would be. Well, Dr. Rao, another great episode. Thank you so much. We have one more coming, and that one's on Galileo. So we will talk to you next week about that. So thanks again for your time.
Okay, thanks again.
All right.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Apologetics Series on the SSPX Podcast and on our YouTube page. Please consider subscribing to the YouTube account and the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever fine podcasts are found. And please consider leaving a rating or a review on this podcast. This will help to make sure more people can find this podcast and discover the beauty and the truth of traditional Catholicism. Until next time, thank you for joining us, and God bless you.